Early in the evening of June 8th, a U.S. Army Apache attack helicopter went down near the Strait of Hormuz, and according to reports, the crew wasn't saved by a combat search and rescue helicopter or even by a crewed Navy ship. Instead, those soldiers were rescued by an unmanned surface vessel, or drone boat, called the Corsair, which hails from the Navy's premier drone operating unit in the U.S. Central Command Area of Responsibility, Task Force 59. Now, this drone rescue marks what may well be a first for the U.S. military, as it invests heavily into rapidly fielding a long list of uncrewed air, surface, and even submersible systems to support everything from intelligence gathering and reconnaissance to direct kinetic action. In fact, in this new era of the Navy looking to field massive nuclear-powered, missile-packing battleships, America's quickly massing fleets of drone vessels may now be the last real vestiges of what the Navy described just a few years ago as its foundational operating concept of distributed maritime operations. Until recently, this DMO concept served as the guiding principle for all of the Navy's admittedly troubled acquisitions, calling for fielding a larger number of smaller warfighting ships to distribute capabilities like weapons and sensors while retaining the ability to concentrate their effects. In very abbreviated terms, the concept argues that it's better to field 10 ships that can each launch 10 missiles than one ship that can launch 100, because, well, it's harder to sink 10 smaller targets than it is one bigger one. But just because most news reporting about Navy shipbuilding's been focused on production backlogs, battleships armed with experimental systems, and frigates armed with, well, not much at all, that doesn't mean the Navy has completely given up on its plans for a widely distributed net of sensors, launchers, minesweepers, and more. And there is a growing list of companies lining up for a slice of that budgetary pie. Because America may really struggle to build large-hulled combat ships, but there is no nation on this planet that builds more small-hulled vessels on an annual basis than the United States. So let's talk about the Navy's rapidly growing drone fleets, the boats and ships being built and tested as we speak, and the future of unmanned combat on the open ocean. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Firepower. There remains some debate about how exactly Iranian forces managed to shoot down this American Apache helicopter, and in fact, whether they even shot it down on purpose at all. Initial reports just stated that the Apache had gone down off the coast of Oman, with the cause of the crash considered unknown. Then, on June 9th, President Trump announced that the helicopter had indeed been shot down while on a patrol, he said, over the Strait of Hormuz, though the patrol part has shifted since then. Now, that would obviously suggest an intentionally aggressive act, but the circumstances of the incident have only gotten murkier. According to an unnamed official who spoke to the Associated Press, the Apache helicopter went down after colliding with an Iranian Shahed-style one-way attack drone in midair. Now, broadly speaking, these attack drones aren't designed or aren't really even capable of engaging airborne targets intentionally. What makes these drones special, after all, is their low cost and simple construction that allows for high-volume saturation attacks. So it really isn't entirely clear, based on the evidence we have right now, if this was an intentional downing or an unintentional collision. But the Pentagon is clearly treating it as intentional. And regardless of intent, the drone apparently did not detonate, but did cause enough damage to force the helicopter into an emergency water landing, leaving the two-person crew stranded in the water for about 2 hours, with American fighters reportedly circling overhead for security until that rescue boat could arrive. And as newsworthy as the downing of an American attack helicopter certainly is, the even bigger story is how those soldiers were rescued. Because as you know, their savior did not come in the form of a rigid hull inflatable boat full of sailors and medics, nor was it a combat search and rescue helicopter. Instead, they were met by a small unmanned surface vessel, or USV, called the Seronic Corsair, which had quietly entered service with the US Navy only about 3 months ago. Now, the Corsair reportedly picked up the 2 soldiers and then transported them out of the area where they could then be picked up by helicopter. At about 24 feet long, the Corsair is about the size of a large speedboat, and it can carry payloads of up to 1,000 pounds at ranges of over 1,150 miles and at speeds of up to 35 knots, or about 40 miles per hour. The Navy has not disclosed how many of these drones that it's got, but we do know they entered service with the Navy's Task Force 59 and its operational counterpart, Task Group 59.1, in March of this year, after receiving a $392 million Navy contract for an undisclosed number of drone platforms in August of last year, which was funded under an other transaction agreement, and we're going to circle back to that part a bit later. Now, according to Seronic, the Corsair platform has already logged over 100,000 nautical miles. That's over 115,000 standard non-pirate miles in testing so far, which would be nearly enough to circle the globe 5 times. The platform can operate autonomously as a part of larger collaborative swarms or via remote control, with a human in the loop via a 2-way data link to make some decisions, like employing munitions when armed. But as capable as the Corsair may be, it is important to understand that it is just one of several small unmanned surface vessels that the US Navy already has in service, in numbers that seemingly range from maybe a handful to a few dozen to literally hundreds. About a year ago now, we discussed the US Navy's new GARK drone boats, which is a rather unfortunate sounding acronym for Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft. You could probably think of these as something sort of like the US Navy's version of the drone boats that Ukraine's been using to wreak havoc on Russia's Black Sea fleet. Now, these autonomous speedboats are about 16 feet long, with a 5-foot 8-inch beam, and they can carry a payload of up to 1,000 pounds while cruising at around 22 knots. That's about 25 miles per hour, or while sprinting at up to 44 knots, or about 50 miles per hour. And with 163 gallons of diesel fuel on board, each of these 200 horsepower drone boats can cover more than 805 miles in a hurry, or more than 1,840 at a leisurely pace. Now, these vessels are rated to operate in the open ocean at a sea state of 5, which is no joke. We're talking waves ranging from 8 to 13 feet high, where most civilian boats wouldn't dare go, and where even most Coast Guard cutters might get a bit uncomfortable. In fact, according to GARK's manufacturer, Black Sea Technologies, these boats withstood even larger 15-foot waves, a sea state of 6, during the 5,000 or so hours of operational testing that they've already undergone at the hands of the US Navy. With modular open system architecture, these GARK boats are designed to quickly integrate different suites of sensors, communications equipment, or other, quote, mission-specific payloads, wink, wink, weapon systems, and with the ability to operate under direct remote control or autonomously for days or even weeks on end. They can provide the US Navy with persistent forward intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with minimal risk, really no risk to personnel or to pricier platforms. And when it comes time for offensive operations, GARKs can work together using collaborative swarming logic to overwhelm adversary defenses anywhere from the open ocean to shallow coastal waters. But if you ask me, the real value proposition of these GARKs isn't in their ability to handle heavy seas or take on risky mission sets or even their relatively low observable design. No, the real magic of the GARK is in its ability to have all of those things, while Black Sea Technologies is able to deliver these drone boats quickly and at a pretty reasonable price point. In fact, you might be surprised to learn just how many of these autonomous high seas speedboats the Navy's already got. Now, these days, Black Sea Technologies is producing more than one completed GARK boat per day, and averaging roughly 32 deliveries to the Navy per month, with, quote, many hundreds of these unmanned surface vessels already in the Navy's hands at the start of this year, according to the company's president, Bob Putney. When we last discussed these drone boats, I told you that the first 24 GARKs cost the U.S. Navy nearly $160 million, which shook out to around $6.5 million a piece, or around the price of 2 single-use long-range anti-ship missiles. But I also told you that those costs would all but certainly drop quickly once full-scale production was underway, and as of February 2026, the reported cost per GARK has already dropped to under $1 million. Now, that's obviously still a fortune to mere mortals like you and me, but in terms of autonomous seagoing vessels, that's a downright bargain. After all, the Navy spends more than $1 million on each Tomahawk missile that it launches, which obviously can only be used once. But as capable and as promising as the GARK platform is, the Navy is not putting all of its unmanned surface vessel eggs into any one or even two baskets. And very quietly, the U.S. Navy is quickly becoming the largest operator of fully integrated drone vessel systems on the planet. Though it should certainly be noted that Ukraine absolutely holds the title for having the most operational experience with these kinds of maritime drones in combat. And I chose that word quietly pretty intentionally here, because unlike many other defense acquisitions, the Navy has been, pretty opaque about the real scope of its small unmanned surface vessel fleets, often making purchases under rapid acquisition authorities or fielding large numbers of systems that are all technically designated as prototypes, and generally just focusing on finding ways to get these platforms into service in the variety of ways that they can, rather than relying on traditional and usually much slower moving ship procurement models that really do have a tendency to stretch out timelines. And as a result, we often get news about unmanned surface vessels like Seronic Corsair being used in real combat operations, like Monday night's rescue of an Apache crew, without any formal announcement regarding the number of these vessels that are in service or the number that will ultimately be delivered. That is to say that while the Navy is pretty open about already having a variety of relatively small autonomous vessels in service, actually nailing down how many the Navy's got is practically impossible. All we really know is that these systems are already seeing combat in places like the Middle East, and at minimum, the total fleet count is well into the hundreds and is very literally growing every day. So let's see what we can determine by looking at the timeline of U.S. Navy small unmanned surface vessel efforts, which arguably started with the establishment of that aforementioned Task Force 59 back in October of 2021. Now, that same month, Task Force 59 was photographed operating a pair of Mantis T-12 unmanned surface vessels alongside Navy patrol craft off the coast of Bahrain during exercise New Horizon. Now, Mantis in this context is short for Man-Portable Tactical Autonomous Systems, with the T-12 considered the most modern of the line's 8 drone variants. At roughly 12 feet long, 3 feet wide, and about 14 inches high, these small USVs can carry intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance payloads of up to about 140 pounds, which can include Seafleer 230 electro-optical systems, Teledyne Resin T20P side sonar scanning devices, Teledyne Blueview M900 forward-looking sonar, and Black Hornet Nano unmanned aerial systems, little drones to be launched for further intelligence gathering. Now, these semi-submersible drone boats can sprint at speeds as high as 40 knots. That's about 46 miles per hour, and they can cruise at speeds anywhere between 8 and 20 knots, about 9 to 23 miles per hour, for distances of up to 69 miles and sea states higher than 4 or larger than 3 to 5 foot waves. It isn't currently clear how many of these T-12s the U.S. Navy operates, but we do know that the Navy started providing T-12s to the Philippine Navy in 2024 for the purposes of policing the South China Sea. So they've got enough to spare. 2 months after Task Force 59 was established, those T-12s in operational testing were joined by the Saildrone Explorer, which is a 23-foot unmanned surface vessel designed to operate autonomously at sea for 100 days or more at a time. Now, these intelligence-gathering vessels provide consistent data collection for weather monitoring and operational planning, and true to that name, Saildrone, they leverage wind for propulsion, providing practically unlimited range at pretty low speeds of just 1 to 3 knots. And just like those T-12s, we have no idea how many of these drones are out there soaking up data on the open water, but we do know there are at least 20 currently monitoring shipping activity along America's southern approaches under the U.S. Navy's 4th Fleet and the U.S. Southern Command, while an undisclosed number of them are also actively conducting wide area surveillance and the U.S. Central Command or CENTCOM area of responsibility, meaning the Middle East. Now, during that same 2-month span, Task Force 59 reportedly also started testing the T-38 Devil Ray, which is such a big small unmanned surface vessel that some outlets actually refer to it as a medium-sized one. And there's good reason for that. Like most things defense, there are no universally recognized definitions for what constitutes a small versus a medium unmanned surface vessel. But the U.S. Navy places the defining line at 38 feet, meaning unmanned ships that are 39 feet and longer are medium-sized, and vessels that are 38 feet and shorter are considered small. The Devil Ray comes in at 38 feet on the dot. Now, like other unmanned vessels, the T-38 Devil Ray can reportedly be operated autonomously or by remote control, but with its added size comes added capability, like a 4,000-pound payload capacity and the ability to reach speeds on the open water as high as a whopping 70 knots, or better than 80 miles per hour, according to some sources, and as high as 100 knots. That's about 115 miles per hour, according to others. Now, these extreme speeds are said to be made possible, at least in part, thanks to the vessel's carbon fiber catamaran construction. And that disparity between reported top speeds could well be because the platform comes with 2 different propulsion options, either diesel or gasoline engines. Now, with the vessel cruising at 25 knots, or about 29 miles per hour, it can reportedly cover a whopping 1,200 nautical miles, or about 1,380 standard miles for the non-pirates among us. And as the Navy has confirmed in testing, the platform can double that range by operating just one engine at a time and cruising at lower speeds. Now, we know the Navy's been operating Devil Ray T-38 since 2022, and that one broke a record last month for operating autonomously more than 460 miles off the coast of California for 192 straight hours. That's about 8 full days on its own in the open ocean. But we don't know how many the Navy actually has. Most credible estimates suggest it's probably fewer than a dozen, but we really don't know. By the end of Task Force 59's first full year of operation, going into 2022, the U.S. Navy announced that it already had 15 advanced small unmanned surface vessel platforms in testing, with 10 of those systems already seeing real-world operational testing in places like the Middle East. But importantly, up until that point, the Navy had really only demonstrated these platforms' ability to serve as unmanned sensor platforms. And sometimes, warfighting needs to get a lot more kinetic than that. So, Task Force 59 made the leap to using real weapons in Exercise Digital Talon, held off the coast of Bahrain in October of 2023, when a T-38 Devil Ray employed live, lethal miniature aerial missile systems against a target boat, with a human operator on board a nearby ship making the final decision to fire only after artificial intelligence had already located and identified the target. And within a year of that exercise, exercise, the U.S. Navy established Task Group 59.1 in Bahrain, followed by Unmanned Surface Vessel Squadron 3 in San Diego, both focused on taking these systems out of operational testing and putting them into actual operational service. And maybe the most important point to take away from all of that is that the Navy's small unmanned surface vessel efforts are, even today, still in their infancy, despite already boasting operational fleets with much more capability than the general public tends to be aware of. And those capabilities, of course, extend well beyond scooping up downed pilots out of the drink. Higher-end platforms like the Devil Ray may already be good at slinging missiles at enemy ships, but the most potent benefit the Navy may get from these smaller drones isn't quite as flashy on YouTube, despite being a vital part of modern combat operations. And that is persistent maritime domain awareness, which is contracting language for being able to keep tabs on a huge swath of the open ocean. According to Saildrone, the company that builds the Saildrone Explorer, employed by both Task Force 59 and the U.S. Navy's 4th Fleet, which is, again, part of U.S. Southern Command, between 2023 and 2024, Southcom was able to keep tabs on 116,000 waterborne contacts spread out over 12,500 square nautical miles. That's about 14,385 square miles for, again, those of us not wearing eye patches, using their extended duration explorers, and all for a reported cost of only about $4.25 per square nautical mile per day. Now, in places like the Pacific, where vast expanses of the open ocean create all sorts of problems for domain awareness, that sort of capability could be a game changer for American forces keeping tabs on Chinese positions. Now, as I've already said a few times, because the Navy has sourced the majority of its small drone boat fleets through various lines of accounting that fall outside that traditional program of record model, it is really tough to assess just how many of these systems the Navy has, how many it has in total, and especially how many are considered operational. But to get a sense of just how quickly these fleets have grown, we can look to statements made by U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Christopher Alexander, who said in January that the Navy's active or operational inventory of small USVs at the start of 2025 was 4. And by the end of 2025 was 400. And he expects that number to eclipse 500 this fiscal year. And to be clear, that may even be something of a pretty significant understatement, especially on the tail of the publicity garnered by that Corsair's rescue of those Apache crew members and the Navy's really heavy investments into these unmanned systems. In December of 2025, Seronic reported having the production capacity to build between 400 and 500 Corsairs per year at its facility in Austin, Texas, putting them at a similar op tempo to Black Sea Technologies and their smaller GARK boats. But by March of 2026, Seronic reported that number had already risen to building 1,000 Corsairs per year, with a new production target of reaching 2,000 per year in the not-too-distant future. And of course, while we're focusing on the Navy's quick successes with these small unmanned surface vessels, we should not lose sight of the fact that they are just one element of a much broader investment, to the tune of about $7 billion this fiscal year alone, into drone vessels of all sizes that operate not just on the surface, but below it too. Just last week, the U.S. Navy announced that the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group will be joined for the first time by a medium unmanned surface vessel built by Leidos called the Seahawk on its upcoming deployment. Now, these types of vessels have been deployed to the Pacific before, but have never served as part of an operational carrier strike group. And while we might call the Corsair or the GARK drone boats, the Seahawk is a legitimate drone ship. At roughly 135 feet long, about 41 meters, and displacing more than 155 tons, The Seahawk's twin diesel engines can propel it to speeds as high as 27 knots, or about 31 miles per hour. And maybe most impressive of all, the ship and its older sister, the Sea Hunter, were designed to operate at sea for months at a time without any maintenance or any crew on board whatsoever. The vessel holds 14,000 gallons of fuel, giving it an unrefueled range of over 10,000 nautical miles, or more than 115,000 non-pirate miles at a 12-knot pace. The Navy envisions using these vessels as distributed sensor platforms and for anti-submarine warfare, and eventually even mine countermeasures. Seronic, the firm behind the Corsair, also has larger vessels on the docket, with their own medium unmanned surface vessel dubbed Marauder entering sea trials last year. And at 180 feet long, nearly 50 meters, this ship is rated to carry payloads of up to 150 tons and can accommodate up to 4 40-foot ISO containers or 8 20-foot ones. And that is particularly important because the US military has been really investing heavily into fully containerized weapon systems, like counter-drone systems that launch AGM-179 JAGMs, or Joint Air-to-Ground Missiles, they're Lockheed's new replacement for the Hellfire, and long-range strike options like Anduril's containerized Barracuda 500 launch system, which houses 16 cruise missiles inside a 20-foot ISO container, each with a range of roughly 575 miles, or about 925 kilometers, carrying a warhead with more than 5 times the destructive capacity of a Hellfire missile. Now that means a single Marauder could potentially carry 128 long-range cruise missiles to supplement a carrier strike group's firepower. Or, for an even more potent option, Seronic and weapons manufacturer Castilian announced plans literally just a few days ago to conduct the first ever live-fire test of a hypersonic missile launched from an unmanned surface vessel, the Marauder, in 2027, using Castillion's Blackbeard low-cost hypersonic missile. Now, the capabilities of the Blackbeard missile remain really murky, but it's believed to offer a range of around 500 miles, and in order to meet the criteria to be considered a hypersonic missile, it would need to do that at speeds above Mach 5 while maneuvering to prevent intercept. Now, the U.S. Army and Navy are both pursuing both ground and air-launched variants of this Blackbeard weapon, so it only makes sense that we would see if we could launch them from drone boats as well. And the Navy's Ghost Fleet of unmanned ships extends well below the surface of the water. In fact, it dates back the furthest down there, though just like the small unmanned surface vessels, the Navy has been similarly tight-lipped about just how many drone subs it's got stalking the ocean today. All we can really say for sure, based on statements made by manufacturers about deliveries, is that, well, the number is certainly in the triple digits somewhere. The Navy's Mark 18 UUV, for instance, saw production between 2012 and 2023 in both 150-pound and then much larger 600-pound iterations, and they've been a part of the Navy's suite of expeditionary mine countermeasure systems for so long now that Navy officials already consider them legacy systems, as even newer systems like the Lionfish come online. General Dynamics' Knifefish is another countermine torpedo-shaped submersible. This one stretches 22 feet long and weighs in at 2,000 pounds. And according to the Wall Street Journal, these are already seeing operational use in the Strait of Hormuz today. And, of course, there are even larger underwater drones, like Boeing's 85-foot Orca and Northrop Grumman's Manta Ray, which is 33 feet long with a 45-foot wingspan, both of which are currently in testing. And I want to be clear here that this is anything but an exhaustive list. Much like the rapidly expanding collaborative combat aircraft market, it seems like new maritime drones are popping up just about every day, and they are sure to continue for some time to come. And with that in mind, we should also remember that if we know about these ones, there are a bunch more that we don't know about. And if I'm honest, that all rings as good news for the US Navy, which has really demonstrated a lot of trouble with producing full-sized warships at scale, but has been moving lightning fast when it comes to fielding these smaller, uncrewed assets. So suffice to say that an Apache going down after colliding with a drone, only to have that crew saved by another drone, might seem like a pretty unusual headline today. But if you ask me, it's really just a glimpse of warfare's future. And with that ends this edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day, or better yet, just download the entirely free Sandboxx News app to stay on top of all things military. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.